Let's get on the road. So, today I wanted to talk about the nature of mind and how you might hear analogies about reflection or mirror, or you might hear that the mind has a reflective quality to it, and what that means, and how you can observe that in real time. So I think one of the most important things to see regarding awakening is to see that this self is essentially made of thought. And thought is not the narrative content itself, but what that narrative content refers to or seems to refer to, which you can never find. So in every narrative thought, and every thought you can have, there's a suggested narrative self that it refers to. And that is, of course, another thought. It's the fundamental assumption upon which all thoughts are based. So when there's no thought, we can't find the self. But seeing the way it works in real time is what shatters the illusion. And for some people, you see the way it works, and then instantly the illusion's shattered it's just a big moment of realization, it seems to be. Others, it comes apart in bits. There's still a belief there for a while, but it's the belief in it is entirely gone. And there's no doubt that this self, which has been struggling through life, doesn't actually exist. That's awakening. So, sorry, I don't know where I am, so I'm just making sure I'm going the right way. So, what you can also find as well is, combined with that narrative self, that thought of self, that fundamental subject or assumption, there's also, for me, there was a distinctive feeling of self, a distinctive emotional flavour of self. Maybe it was combined from multiple kind of emotions, but it was distinctive. And when I could look at it, when I could look at it, I knew it wasn't real, because I could look at it as an object, as a thing. I could observe it. And again, it's that backward step, continually until there's no believable part of the illusion left. But when you hear the reflection analogy, basically what that means is that you can observe how thought reflects itself, thought perpetuates itself or informs itself. So you know, you get into a thought stream or you get lost in thought. You can see this happening. So one thought informs another thought, which informs another thought, or one thought is a reflection of another thought, is a reflection of another thought. Or you could say one leads on to, or as a basis for another thought, is another thought. And it bounces around like that. And that's why it's so deceiving, because we never that movement around looking at the content from this point, seemingly from this point of view of the self, we assume that point of view of the self, we never look at it, we just assume it's there. Inquiry is about just turning around and looking at it. Who does this thought refer to? Talking about, I thought might be an overt narrative, like I don't like this, I don't like that. This person said this to me, I did this, and it's all that all refers to a person. There are other ways in which it might not be so subtle. You might be thinking about, like, say you're into spirituality. We'll make it relevant into spirituality and stuff, and you're thinking in a cognitive sense about what this means and what that means, and this is interesting, try to figure it out. All of that refers to a person that's trying to figure it out, a person that's thinking about it, self. Again, why it's tricky. Inquiry is turning around and looking for, who does that refer to? When we're following the content of thought, not looking at the thought itself, it's like you're being carried away by thought. When you look at the thought, like, what is the thought? What is it made of? What is its texture? What is this thought? That can stop dead, that momentum. Because you're no longer looking at what the thought refers to, or from who the thought refers to. You're looking at the thought itself, let's say the one thought. And when we do that stalls that engine, that stalls that process. We can even go, what will the next thought be? So again, that's us looking at the thought. What will the next thought be? Not what will be my next thought, or what next thought will I have, but what is the next thought? And then that cultivates the gap. So you notice a big difference between how it feels to be lost in thought, to be following along, and you see there's a kind of movement to it, there's a momentum to it, there's an asleepness to a sleep quality to it, an unconscious quality to it. And then you can think to yourself, okay, what is a thought? Let's make a thought. Let's see the thought. I'm going to think. Of course, it's not. We're trying not to identify with the thinker, but I'm gonna think this, and then think it, and then look at that. Think it as loud as you can, and see what it is, what it feels like, what it sounds like, and you're consciously looking at it, but hopefully not from the perspective of the thinker. The thinker is very subtle, but it seems so solid because it's mixed up with that emotional, distinctive flavour of the self, which is congealed over time based on our life experiences and so on in the emotional body. That's why it seems so solid, that's why it seems so real. But when you actually look for it, it's flimsy. It's super flimsy. It's not, you're not going to find it. There's no chance. But you have to do the search. You can't just say there is no thinker, because that might not be your experience. You could say that there is no thinker, but the thinker is thinking that thought. That's why it's tricky. That's why these techniques are powerful. The inquiry. Who thinks the thought? What will the next thought be? What is a thought? Who does this thought, or what does this thought refer to? Where am I? Who am I? What am I? They're all designed to, let's say, take that backward step, have that perspective, that awareness, to not be so narrowly lost in it. So it feels like, what it feels like, so you can look for it and how it feels. Being lost in thought feels like a down and in contraction, kind of like blinkered experience. And then when you recognise, you come out of it, you expand. That's what it feels like. It's a dilation of attention and consciousness. You can look for that, so you're trying to dilate as much as possible. You're zooming out, you're taking that backward step. That allows you to see the process as it happens and see the illusion for what it is. And eventually it comes to the point where we see that reflection analogy, that I am, that consciousness, is another version of the thinker in a bigger scale, another thought, another label, another interpretation. Because that's narrative self only operates from a single point, a centralized point of view, or a fabricated centralized point of view, position. It can only interpret things. Reality doesn't need to be a reflection. It doesn't need to be reflected upon. It doesn't need something separate from it to make it clear. And that's all the narrative identity knows how to do. It constructs its entire world based on a flawed and incomplete picture of reality. It mirrors reality and then it interprets it. Those interpretations are biased or filtered through the conditioning of the individual based on personal history and so on. Hence, always incomplete, always biased, always incorrect, and always permeated with some form of discontent and suffering. So that's the mechanism. But it has to be seen experientially, directly in real time. It can't be believed by the mind. The mind will believe. If I start thinking, my mind will start doubting reality. The doubt is the mind's ability to doubt, or propensity to create a position of doubt, is still running, is still there. That's not completely gone yet. But I don't need to engage in that, or I don't believe in the doubt. Although the doubt thoughts, they can come up. They can come up. But it gets to the point where they're just, it's a pattern somewhere stuck in the body mind. The pattern still echoes out, and it's like a distant echo of that narrative self, but that was previously fully believed in, fully ran this experience. But again, I don't know if this is true for everyone, but in my case, it just took practice. It wasn't me that was doing the practice. It seemed like it, but it just took repetition. It just took what I explained with those techniques. You know how you get lost in thought, and then everyone who's watching this, all three people who are watching this will know. Will know that feeling of being lost in thought and then remembering, or realising I'm lost in this narrative, and then maybe the narrative will pull you back in. It's very strong in the beginning, but that's the first part of awakening, realising that's a narrative, that's not real, realising you're lost in it. You are lost in it. You're something else. You're not that narrative, that thinker. You're not what that narrative refers to. And that realising, that remembering, like, oh, I've been lost, and you it's a waking up feeling. It's an extra expanded alertness. In daily life, that little realisation of, oh, I'm lost in thought, again, it's happened again, these are thoughts, and then honing in, and really seeing what is the thought, like in meditation, like what will the next thought be? Who does this thought refer to? Where is the thinker? These are all designed to stop the momentum of the mind. And we can use various techniques. For me, it was walking outside. A lot of people will like to shut off the senses and kind of quiet down the experience, the sensory experience enough so that they can really focus. For me, the scenery and the sensation and the sound, where I noticed that if my attention was on the sensations, the thoughts became somewhat peripheral, and that experience was more taking up more of my experience, attention. So I'd made a hobby out of it, looking for things that I'd not seen before, that attention, listening for sounds, enjoying the sounds, moving my attention around, and that moved it all away from that mind narrative. And the mind narrative would creep in, and then it would take me sometimes, and then I'd remember, be like, oh, okay, these are thoughts, I'm lost in thought, and then I would come back, and it was that kind of contraction, expansion, in and out, in and out, in and out, and gradually, over time, the intensity of the experience, the sensory experience of awareness, being aware of this direct, immediate sensory experience, overtook the mind narrative. The mind narrative diminished to the point where the thoughts aren't overt they're not in your face, they're not loud in your mind. They're there though, but they're quiet down, and they're kind of like in the background. They're still running, not trying to control them or stop them, but they diminished down to the point where the narrative, what they were talking about, wasn't even obvious to me, but the movement was still there. It was still moving around. It was still the changing the form of thoughts, the thoughts informing each other and bouncing about. And eventually it got to the point where there were moments of complete stillness, or what seemed like complete stillness, where thoughts weren't even there. And when that happened, the difference in the intensity and the aliveness of the experience was drastic. And then within that, this awakening, these insights started to come forth, and it seemed like all it took was practice, creating a new habit, creating a new hobby based on dilating that attention, becoming more acutely aware of immediate presence, immediate sensory awareness, experience. It seems like all it takes is forming a new habit. It's like programming the mind to, programming the attention to disidentify from the mind. Maybe that's not a good way to put it, because it's kind of the same thing, but it seems like that. It seems like there's like a kind of duality. Turns out it's not like that ultimately, but it seems like there's a separation from, or a radical disidentification from this narrative that's just running on its own anyway. Because when you try and control the narrative, you're back in the narrative. When you try and open up and accept experience for what it is, including the narrative, that's when the narrative starts to quiet down, paradoxically enough. So I would suggest that habitual inquiry, that habitual stepping back and zooming out, observing the mind for what it is and what it does without judging it or without trying to change it, without saying thoughts are bad or that this narrative self is bad. Because ultimately a narrative self wants what's best for itself, it wants what's best for this body and mind. It's trying to do a good thing, it's trying to survive. It's very endearing in that way, and the mind is amazing, an amazing tool. So having the gratitude for that, and having the gratitude for the fact that that is what brought us here in the first place, even the suffering included, having the gratitude for the way things are and have been, and accepting that and loving that. But at the same time, seeing it for what it is, observing those patterns for what they are in real time. So remembering all the time, not just during meditation, but in all of life. It's easy when we meditate, when the conditions are right, when the environment are right, and the circumstances. But I think for me it seemed to be closing those gaps. Where there was full identification with the mind narrative, if you were to look at it in like a linear time thing and frame it that way. And just practicing that inquiry consistently. What is this thought? What is the next thought? Who does this thought refer to? Where is the thinker? Who am I? What am I? What is not a thought? What am I adding to experience? Anyway, that'll do for now. Talk to you next time.